news broadcast and many news articles written in various newspapers, internet journalism, and print journalism. And there have been several tributes to the late Pope Francis, who died at the age of 88. But I found an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal. It's very lengthy, that that I think was written very well, and at the same time, it addresses the late Pope in a respectable manner. So I want to talk about it. Tyrone Bowman Live. I'd like to share it with you, and hopefully uh, it will bless you at the same time. The headline reads from the Wall Street Journal in the obituary section: Pope Francis, advocate for economic and social justice, dies at 88. Pontiff urged grassroots activists around the world to bridge the gap between rich and poor. And as you can see, there's a nice photo of the late Pope Francis. There are some other photos in here I'll be showing as well. This article was written for the Wall Street Journal by Francis F. Rocca. So it was updated April 21st at 6:53 p.m. So let's talk about it, coming out of Vatican City for the Wall Street Journal. Pope Francis, who sought to refocus the Catholic Church on promoting social and economic justice, rather than traditional moral teachings, but presided over growing divisions in the Church, and struggled with the lingering scandal of clerical sex abuse, has died. He was 88. The Pope's death came after he spent weeks in the hospital earlier this year to treat a series of pneumonia, or a bout with pneumonia. His health remained fragile after he returned to his residence in the Vatican. The cause of death was a stroke and cardiac arrest, according to a medical bulletin released by the Vatican. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was a pope of first. He was the first pope from the Americas, the first from the Jesuit order, and the first to take the name Francis. He was the first in almost 6 centuries to become pope after his predecessor resigned. Francis also gave the papacy a less formal and more approachable image by spurning regale attire, riding in compact cars, and making headlines with blunt comments at news conferences. He was openly political, urging grassroots activists around the world to bridge the gap between rich and poor, while calling on wealthier countries to better protect the environment. As Western politicians moved to close their borders to refugees, Francis advocated for them and other migrants. In February, he criticized President Trump's plan for mass deportations. He maintained a neutral stance on the war in Ukraine, deploring the suffering of Ukrainians by avoiding direct condemnation of Russia and suggesting that the West had provoked the conflict. Francis's policy of playing down traditional church teachings on marriage and homosexuality. His most famous single remark was a rhetorical question about gay priests. Quote, "Who am I to judge?" End quote. Cheered liberals while distressing conservative Catholics, including many bishops in the U.S. But he stopped short of relaxing rules on celibacy for Roman Catholic priests, disappointing progressive bishops in Latin America and elsewhere who argue that it would remedy shortages of clergy. Francis endorsed zero tolerance for priests who sexually abused children, but victims and their supporters said he didn't do enough to tackle the problem. In the biggest scandal of his pontificate, a former Vatican diplomat publicly accused him of turning a blind eye to sexual misconduct by a U.S. cardinal and called on him to resign. Francis's decision over whom to appoint as cardinals, the men who will elect his successor, were notably strategic. He passed over prominent conservative bishops installed by his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, in dioceses such as Los Angeles and Venice, and appointed others from places such as Tonga and Laos, far from the church's major population centers. By the time of his death, the Pope had named about 2/3 of the cardinal electors A two-thirds majority of electors is required to select the Pope. Whether the next Pope pursues or diverges from Francis' agenda, the tensions and polarization that grew under his stewardship are likely to persist across his church. He was born on December 17, 1936, in Buenos Aires, the first of five children of an Italian immigrant father and an Argentine woman of Italian origin. He studied at a vocational high school with a focus on chemistry and worked occasionally as a doorman in local bars, where he was known as a proficient tango dancer. Matter of fact, here are some photos of the late Pope when he was younger and as he progressed into who he would become. Just shy of his 17th birthday, he felt an urge to enter a church and confess his sins. When he later decided to become a priest, his mother objected, telling him she hoped he would pursue a medical career. He told her that he would be studying, quote, medicine of the soul, end quote. After joining the Jesuits, an order that emphasized social justice, the future Pope volunteered for missionary work in Japan but was turned down. He later said because he had lost part of his right lung to pneumonia at the age of 20. He was ordained a priest in 1969 and 4 years later was named the provincial or leader of Argentina's Jesuits at the extraordinarily young age of 36. Bergoglio was still serving at that role when a military dictatorship overtook Argentina in 1976. His record in that period would weigh on him for years to come. Some accuse him of having collaborated with the junta's, quote, dirty war, end quote, against its political opponents, including two Jesuits who were kidnapped and tortured for several months. Nobel Peace Laureate Adolfo Perez Esquivel, a former political prisoner of the dictatorship, later exonerated Francis of complicity with the regime and credited him with quiet diplomacy on behalf of its victims. The Pope himself acknowledged criticisms of his record, pointing to his tendency to make quick decisions. After making enemies within the Jesuit order, for which he blamed his authoritarian manner, he was transferred to the city of Cordoba, more than 400 miles from the capital, Buenos Aires, where he spent 2 years. He later described this as a time of, quote, great interior crisis, close quote. His exile ended in 1992 when his friend Cardinal Antonio Quarcino convinced Pope John Paul II to appoint him as one of Buenos Aires' auxiliary bishops. When the cardinal died in early 1998, Bergoglio succeeded him as leader of the city's Catholics, and he became a cardinal in 2001. Some more selected photos by the Wall Street Journal of the late Pope Francis. Let's continue the article. In the years that followed, Bergoglio became known for living a modest life and ministering to Buenos Aires' sprawling shanty towns. He spurned the Archbishop's palace in favor of a simple apartment where he cooked his own meals and rode the bus and subway instead of taking a chauffeured car. When John Paul died in 2005, Bergoglio emerged as the leading liberal candidate to succeed him. John Paul had reversed much of the progressive momentum that followed the Second Vatican Council, which aimed to rebalance the Church's relationship and the modern world during the 1960s. But the conclave instead elected Benedict, who continued the previous Pope's conservative line. Then in February of 2013, Benedict shocked the world by resigning, pleading the debility of old age. Bergoglio, by then 76-year-old, wasn't on many short lists of progressive successors. Yet a small group of liberal cardinals quickly lobbied for his candidacy. The cardinal also impressed his peers shortly before the vote with a speech that said, "The Church must come less focused on itself and direct its energy toward evangelizing the wider world." Many observers took that as an implicit or implicit retort to Benedict's prediction that the Church in the West was shrinking to a faithful core. On just the fifth ballot of March 13th, the Cardinals chose Bergoglio as the 265th successor to St. Peter. When he emerged on the balcony, of St. Peter's Basilica. He stood without the former cape other popes had worn and greeted the crowd below with a simple, quote, good evening, close quote, before asking them to bless him. Some more photos here, if you want to see them. Try to keep it as picturesque as I possibly can while reading. Over the following days, it became clear that Francis would be a different sort of pontiff. He rode around in a Ford Focus and stayed in a two-room suite in the Vatican guest house rather than move into the Apostolic Palace, where popes usually sleep. He set up bodies to reform the Vatican's finances and overhaul its bureaucracy and make it, quote, a poor church for the poor, close quote, that reflected his choice of papal name after St. Francis of Assisi, a medieval church reformer who abandoned a life of wealth for extreme poverty. He continued efforts begun under Benedict to prevent money laundering at the scandal-plagued Vatican Bank, which was widely seen as having cleaned up its act. He centralized the Vatican's investments and put them under the oversight of a panel of outside experts. He touted a Vatican's trial of 10 people, including a once powerful cardinal, as evidence of greater transparency and accountability. In regard to those investments, the cardinal is appealing against his conviction for financial malfeasance. The Pope criticized global capitalism and often called attention to the plight of migrants, as when he prayed at the Mexican border for those who died trying to reach the U.S. in his 2015 ecological encyclica, Laudato Si. The Pope called on political leaders to reduce carbon emissions to combat climate change. Francis also made a priority of improving ties with the Islamic world, washing the feet of Muslims on Holy Thursday, visiting 9 Muslim-majority countries and insisting that Islam was like Christianity, a religion of peace. He also tried to improve the Vatican's relations with China by giving Beijing's communist government a say in appointing bishops there, though some Chinese Catholics accused him of abandoning the country's, quote, underground, close quote, church, which rejects government control. If Francis had a byword for his papacy, it was, quote, mercy, end quote, which he made the theme of a special Jubilee year starting in 2015. He often spoke of putting forgiveness ahead of censure and judgment and loosened the traditional ban on communion for divorced Catholics who remarry without their first marriages being annulled. He met with a gay couple and transgender men, suggested Catholics follow their consciences in using contraception to prevent a disease, supported civil unions for same-sex couples, and called for an end to anti-homosexual laws. Conservatives, including some cardinals and bishops, complained that the Pope was blurring the lines on doctrine and even trying to change it. They also feared he would loosen the traditional celibacy requirements for Roman Catholic priests, though in 2020 he surprised most observers by declining not to do so. During his watch, bishops in Germany acted as the church's progressive vanguard, holding a series of meetings where they called for changes including women's ordination, blessings for same-sex relationships, a greater role for lay people in church governments, and relaxation of the celibacy requirements for priests. While Francis expressed some unease with the Germans' initiative and warned them not to stray too far from the rest of the church, he also called a global synod, which culminated in meetings at the Vatican in fall of 2024. The conclusions disappointed progressives who were hoping for dramatic changes. However, no controversy during his reign rivaled the impact of the scandals over the sexual abuse of children by priests. Francis hardly mentioned the topic in the first year of his papacy. When he did set up an advisory body on child protection that included former victims of abuse, he didn't act on any of its principal recommendations, including creating a special tribunal to judge bishops who abused or covered up abuse. Bishops in the U.S. and a handful of other countries urged him to adopt their practice of permanent barring abusers from serving as priests across the whole church. Instead, Pope Francis established a board that reduced the sentences of a large majority of abusers to periods as short as 3 years, reversing the policy of the previous Pope. Here are a couple more select photos here real quick. Francis angered sex abuse victims again in 2018 by repeatedly saying a Chilean bishop accused of covering up abuse was a victim of slander. He later said he had been misinformed and accepted the resignations of several Chilean bishops implicated in abuse scandals. Later that same year, a former Vatican envoy to the U.S. accused the Pope of ignoring allegations of sexual misconduct against then Cardinal Theodore McCormick, a former Archbishop of Washington, D.C., and making him an advisor. Francis waited until the following spring to deny the accusations, by which time a Vatican court had found it McCormick, who had denied wrongdoing, guilty of sexual abuse of minors and sexual misconduct with adults. He was the first cardinal in modern times to be removed from the priesthood. During 2019, Francis responded to criticism with a number of high-profile initiatives against same-sex abuse. They included a global summit of bishops on the topic, who abuse or cover up abuse, and a relaxation of secrecy rules for church documents relating to abuse, making it easier for church officials to cooperate with police and prosecutors. However, advocates for abuse victims criticize the process for investigating and disciplining bishops as lacking in transparency. But Francis's biggest legacy for the church could be his focus on social and economic issues, especially in the global south. Whether that continues will depend on how the coming papal conclave votes. If so, it would be a fitting legacy for a pope who described himself as coming from, quote, the ends of the earth, close quote. Tyrone Bowman. Never surrender, never quit. Oops. Okay, there we go.